You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers looking to build a content engine that drives revenue. In each episode, Camille Trent interviews the marketers behind the best content marketing flywheels and uncovers the tactical aspects of content production, from first draft to first customer.
Eric, thanks for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Anytime. I actually haven't been on a podcast in a while, so I'm excited.
Well, no, I'm glad that I got you on here. I mean, backstory for everyone else is listen to you on the Superpath podcast. Started like binging some episodes, and yeah, it was like perfect timing because I was just like looking into content ops and SEO, and I was like selfishly like I have to get you on, pick your brain so that I can steal all your secrets. Like that's why you're here, and that's my ulterior motive here.
Perfect. Yeah. If a really good self-promotion tip for anyone is like be in the first 3 episodes of anyone's podcast, because like Jimmy said, it's one of the most listened to episodes ever, but I think it's just because I was like the second or third one. So when people go to listen to it, they start from the beginning, right? And so find your friends who are starting podcasts and volunteer to be on them from the beginning. That's my secret, that if you take nothing away from this episode.
I was going to say, like, yeah, if you learn nothing else, like that is a great tip. It's just like, you starting a podcast, or anyone who's out there that's just like, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Like, who would you recommend? Just say yourself, like just me. Just raise your hand.
I'm the best possible guest.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you got to shoot your shot. All right. Well, so this is a perfect, jumping off point. I said, I mentioned SEO, content ops. That's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. But more specifically, like when we chatted a little bit over LinkedIn, what I heard from it was basically like working yourself out of a job. That's kind of like what I heard on Jimmy's podcast as well. And so I wanted to kind of like start there of first a little background on you. You work at Doc. I'll let you give a little bit more background to yourself. So who are you? Why are you qualified to be here?
Yeah. Eric Doty, content lead at Doc. Yeah, I think I've sort of made a niche for myself as like a one-person marketing team at typically seed stage startups. I come from more of an SEO background. Like I used to work in it was a SEO for realtors and stuff like that, like an agency doing like 20 clients at once and whatever. So I came from this very like SEO background. And so I've been a good fit at like seed stage startups with maybe who need that like long-term SEO growth on top of sort of brand heavy content at the beginning just to be noticed. And so yeah, Doc, I was actually freelancing for Doc through Superpath for like a year, writing 2 blogs a month. And then Alex, the CEO, is like, I'm ready to hire the first marketer. It seems like I've already onboarded you for a year. So it would be a natural fit to just bring you on. And, we did like a little bit of a content strategy exercise. And he was like, okay, you know what you're doing. And yeah, so now I've been at Doc for over a year. And like I said, we're still seed stage, still learning as we go. But it's been for like a 1-person marketing team and like a 10-person company, we've achieved like a lot since I've been there. So happy to talk about any of that stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to dig in because, like I said, I heard that past podcast. A lot of it was about like the SEO content. And I was like, how are things going? And you're like, oh yeah, we're doing that. We're also doing this. We're doing that. And I'm like, what? Like within a year, it sounds like you guys have scaled quite a bit, which makes for a good story. So content obviously means a bunch of different things to different people, different marketers. So what types of content programs do you run at Doc and why?
Yeah, so I think for me, like my title is content lead, but I'm the only marketer. So you end up just being marketer. So maybe there's a few things outside of the scope of a typical content person that those roles I kind of share with my CEO. I'll get into channels in a sec, but like, so Alex he was a VP of marketing at Lattice, which is like a big successful like HR tech, like people management software. And so he was a marketer, and therefore like we can split a lot of marketing duties. He'll just be like, oh, I threw up an ad campaign over the weekend. I'm like, great. Like normally that would have taken a team in a month, and he just did it on his own. Perfect. So in that sense, like there's a lot of things that fall outside of content that like we both just have to do. But in terms of the core content channels that we prioritize, it's been like SEO, which has been primarily blogs, but we also did like a template strategy because Doc is like workspaces where you can like either onboard customers or use it as a sales deal room or use it as like a fundraising room, basically any like workspace you want to like collaborate with somebody else sort of in like a B2B context. And so we made a bunch of templates. So that was like one play we did. We have our own podcast called Grow and Tell, which is like an interview style podcast. Those are the three big ones. But then I'm also responsible for product launches, and we do like at least 2 product releases a month that like require marketing. And what else do I do? We also are doing, and then some sort of like bigger bet projects that I've been like started a lot of them and haven't published any of them yet. So I'm like hesitant a little bit to talk about, but like one example that I'm close to launching is like a big sales enablement library of like examples of really good sales enablement content from like across B2B, like almost similar to like peer signal stuff that you were doing, or like Key Player. I forget which brand was which, but like sort of this like aggregation style content. Anyway, but yeah, the biggest channels have been, the biggest for sure have been like SEO, blog, and podcasts are sort of like the most effortful ones.
Nice. Yeah. And it seems like partly because of your past experience, probably, but also I think just because of the company needs, like that's usually been that SEO content that's been like that foundational piece. So why is it that you typically start with that? And do you think that has to do with the type of company that Doc is? Like, I'm thinking like mid-market, but correct me if I'm wrong, like the type of SaaS product that it is, and does this same approach like apply to, other B2B SaaS companies?
Yeah. So part of it is just like marketer company fit, that I typically got hired into these roles because I have a good SEO background, and it's companies that sort of need SEO to be part of their DNA. Actually, when I joined Doc, we thought we would be more mid-market, lower market, like almost, we had a bit of a vision of more like product-led, almost consumer-y feel to it. That like anyone, something like Notion, right? Or like anyone can use a Notion, can make a Notion document thing and work with either like in a B2B sense, or they can sort of use it in like a more consumer. But Doc, we found over the year or so that I've been at the company, and even like just before I joined, we've learned that we're like a little more upmarket than we thought, and more sales led than we thought, and not as, we still have like a product led motion, and we get a few like self-serve signups, but it tends to be more mid-market deal. And we're not quite moving into like enterprise territory yet, but definitely sort of like mid upper market. Like think Series B companies that are scaling a sales team, or like scaling an onboarding team or a customer success team, where they have suddenly like what worked for very few, what worked for like 5 salespeople isn't going to work for 20 salespeople, and suddenly they need software to handle all this. But the reason I bring all this up is that, so we thought we were going to have like much smaller deal sizes where SEO would be very important, just like big traffic, big signups, have a really good product onboarding experience, and like get people to sign up through the product. We're learning it's a little more sales led than that. But so we really led with SEO to like get us that product led motion. But then we're finding too that now I need to focus just as much on like enablement stuff, like having really good case studies. And I didn't mention case studies, but case studies is a big part of what I'm doing as well. And so that's why I typically start with SEO. Like we thought we'd have contracts more in like the $2,000 range, and we're finding like they're much more than that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. Like this kind of aligns like with what I've seen and like what I think works in terms of where to start. And I have another friend, I don't know if you're familiar with Josh Spilker at all, but he has kind of a similar like profile marketer where it starts like super early stage, typically like PLG type companies, like lower ACV though, but starts with like that SEO plan in terms of, it does like landing pages and blog, and sets like a nice foundation of volume basically, like to get those like initial signups and to kind of like get that first content engine, I guess, like roaring, right? But then but
the other part of that,
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but just the other part of that I just realized too is that if you start too late, then the results are going to come way too late. So it's like good to get so we're still seed stage, but most companies don't start really investing in like the high volume SEO stuff until they're maybe Series A, once they've got more of a marketing team together, maybe even Series B sometimes. But then by the time you're starting, then you have to like get all these backlinks, and you have to build your sort of process out. And we decided to start like way too early, basically, like much earlier than was wise, and like throw more money at it just as a bet that okay, let's say this takes about 2 years. That's about the time when we're probably going to be fundraising ish. So like it aligns with sort of the timeline of the company. It would be awesome if we could have SEO success by this point. It's not necessary for the company to like still be alive or anything by that point, but if we have it, then it will just set us up for so much more success, and it's worth taking a bit of a gamble on.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it takes a while, right? And so like by the time that you need it or you want it to kick in, like you need to have like thought a few moves like ahead of time. And you mentioned, yeah, the marketer fit, right? So knowing your own strengths is part of determining where you should start. Yeah, looking at kind of the business model, right? Like, do we need a lot of volume? Do we need signups, right? Like to get that PLG side running? Do you even have like a PLG side of your business, right? And then I think there's also like, what's everyone else doing? Like, what are your competitors not doing really too, right? And I think for like that sales tech space, it's interesting because they're not all doing SEO like to the same rate as like, you know, MarTech, right? Like MarTech's been doing it since like HubSpot, because they're just, you know, using that same playbook. But sales tech has kind of like done some other things. Not that no other sales tech company is doing this, but if there's opportunity there where it's like, well, we could be the first in our niche, like in our like sales tech category, right, to kind of do this well. So I think it's a combination of those things for me in determining like that what that first thing should be. Is there anything else that you look at in determining that first content step?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, partially too, there's the first step, but there's also like the first year, and seeing where the leaky bucket is in the startup is sort of the challenge. You're just constantly plugging holes as like the first marketer or first content marketer, right? I was at a company previously called Butter, which was, it's like a Zoom alternative. It's like video conferencing software built more for like hosting fun workshops. And that one, like I was brought in to be very like SEO focused, and I came in and like made all this huge SEO strategy. And then we realized that the strategy actually needed to be a little more like retention focused, or like activation focused. So like, yeah, we got lots of product free signups, but the work that content needed to do was actually getting people to go from a free user to a paid user. And so I came in with these grand SEO plans, and we said, actually, like we kind of have a viral product that we don't need to worry about that. The challenge is getting people to pay for it. So like, how do we prove value? How do we explain to people that like, you don't have to rip out Zoom to use this? It's like, it's a different use case. You know, so that was like a totally different marketing challenge that I didn't know I had signed up for, and it was really fun. But even though SEO was the thing that I decided I was going to do, it ended up not being the right thing to do. We completely pivoted and sort of left SEO to the side and focused more on that kind of like whatever, like customer enablement content or whatever you want to call it. So you can't go in with a plan and just stick to it with blinders on in this like pre-product market fit type companies that I tend to be at. You have to be way more like adaptable and flexible.
Yeah, like what's that phrase? It's like the only sure thing is change, right? And yeah. I try and like just remind myself of that going into a new role or taking on something. So it's like, this is a theory. Like whatever content strategy they have coming in is ultimately like just a theory. And that's like a really good, I think, example of this, of like, usually marketers are like responsible for acquisition. Like that's usually the primary problem like that you're solving. But like with certain like PLG products, like, yeah, there is like an inherent virality to them, right? And so if that's really working, it's like, okay, great. Like our problem isn't that we don't have users. It's like that we don't have money. Like they're not paying any money like for this thing. So how do we get them to take that next step, right? And it's, you can still approach it similar, but know that it's like a different type of challenge. So yeah, it actually sounds kind of fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so, okay.
Good step.
Yeah. Like it's just like a totally different type of challenge. And so okay. So that being kind of like the first step. And I think you've made a good case for it being like a good step for any company. Like even if you're an enterprise company, like, and like by the time that you need it, like you want to start it earlier too. Like it's not a bad foundational step for any stage. Like you mentioned you're in mid-market right now, but you guys are a seed stage company, but yeah, by the time that you want it to kick in, like it makes sense to sort of like do it now. So you can kind of make the case for that always being like a first step if that is one of your like core skill sets. But then how did you mentioned like the leaky buckets. So what other leaky buckets did you see like over the year, and sort of like what were the next few content programs that you moved on to?
Yeah. So the next real program after, so we got the blog launched and then the template. So those are kind of our like core SEO plays. And we actually even left the website. Like our product was changing so quickly that I'm really just making all of our landing pages for our core products right now. Like there's pages that if you went to the website today, they're there, but it doesn't really look what the product looks like. It looks like the product a year ago, not the product right now, which is way better. And so, but we were changing so quickly that it wasn't worth investing the time in. We're like, you know what, this says enough. It's close enough to what we are. Let's just leave it. And then when the product sort of gets to more of a mature stage, then let's go through the process of updating like 20 landing pages with visuals or whatever. So that's something I'm actually just tackling right now. But the next real thing we added was podcast. And there's a couple of reasons why we wanted to do it. I mean, the word thought leadership is a buzzword, but when you're in this traffic state that we're in of like, okay, the SEO project or program has started and it'll do its work, but it's not going to fill like our sales team's pipeline overnight, right? It's going to take a year plus for that to really work. We need to just make some noise in the space, like throw some validity behind the doc name. And going back to like marketer company fit, Alex, our CEO, has very like pointed viewpoints on the market, like like he actually has thoughts to lead with, which is great. And therefore we're like, we need to put you front and center, like put you in front of a mic. And he also has really good network of people who have like started, who are in our sort of ICP area, like sales leaders, customer success leaders, marketing leaders, that we can basically not like use their networks, but use the quality of conversation that can happen between the two of them to be the backbone of like a lot of our content strategy going forward. So there's like that immediate network effect of having the podcast, but then we could also then take that show and use it as like social media clips. We can go back to our blog that we've already written and like throw videos in there. We can do all that repurposing stuff that everyone's doing now. But it was like a huge multiplier for our program just to spend like spending 1 hour talking to someone on a podcast like this. You get like way more interesting insights and stuff to come out of it than like 1 hour of SEO blog writing or whatever, right? So like the time trade-off for a tiny team was also just so valuable for us.
Yeah, these are a couple other like buzzy words to bring it back to buzzy words, but the idea of like capture and create, right? Like in terms of demand, what I kept thinking about is just like that decision that every content marketer has to make of like chicken or egg sort of like situations of like, do you create the demand, like, and then you figure out how to capture it? Do you like figure out how to capture what little demand is there? Like, and then you go back to create, right? And it's always like yes and both, like, right. But I can definitely see the case for if we break it down into like SEO capturing like some existing demand that's out there, right? Of people that are, and sometimes it's like redirecting like some of that too, of like people think that they kind of like know what they're looking for, or like some of the problems, like you can kind of like retrofit and like engineer kind of like a different solution of like, oh, you thought you needed this, but like you might actually need something like this. If you're kind of a new category, which I think Doc kind of falls under, right? So you can do some of that. And then it's a matter of, okay, like what else do we have like working for us? What else can we like expand? Like you mentioned of like, our founder like has this network. He's pretty smart. He's pretty like good in front of the camera, right? And so how can we leverage like all of these things that are strengths of ours? So at first it was like, you know, the strength of like you being having an SEO background and like him having, you know, the ability to run ads, right? So employing some of those things, and then it's like, okay, what's the next thing that we can leverage that we already have like a head start in? So I think that's, to me, like another way to think about like what's the next thing to scale. It's like, what's the thing that you're at, like not 0 but like 0.1 at, and like how can it's easier to get like a 0.1 to a 1, right, than like a 0 to a 1. I don't know if that's how you think about it or not, but that's what came to mind.
Yeah, for sure. And there's also, I think there's a good argument for doing a podcast early as well, because then by the time you've recorded, like I think we've recorded 25-ish episodes now, you start to see like themes emerging, and you have this huge library to build off of now, of not just content like recorded video, but also ideas that you see across your guests, and it's super scalable really quickly. Like right now, if I wanted to write a blog on leadership, like sales leadership advice, I could just go through the transcript of our podcast and probably crank that out in like an hour, right? Because we've already done all the work to like the fodder behind the content. And so, but if I was just starting the podcast now, yeah, okay, then it's going to be another year until I have that, like all that sort of stuff to repurpose. So both of those things are like, if we get those going early, and like audience building is super slow for a podcast. Like I wouldn't recommend a podcast to like build an audience. It's more of like you have an audience and you want to like keep them engaged or just like sort of, show them how smart you are, whatever it is, the reason is, but it's not super great in most cases for like growing knowledge of yourself until you get to like the Lenny's podcast kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe that's not your experience, but I think like for us, it's mostly like our existing network are the people listening to it and be like, oh, this is really interesting. This is really smart, versus like, going viral overnight.
Yeah, it's interesting because both of those content plays like are sort of that longer term strategy, right? Like where you can't expect it to hit like overnight. So how do you balance like getting some of those like shorter term wins with the longer term wins?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We like almost ignored short term, to be honest. Like we're getting brand awareness just for doc in the space, or like, you try to get G2 reviews and get, show up as, we're not like at the top of the list for our category, but we're on there and people can find us. There's lots of direct brand searches just from like networking. There's lots of sales stuff happening on the side that like we had an AE. We had one AE for a while. Now we have a head of sales and an AE, and we're hiring a second one. So we have like an outbound motion happening as well. Like, so there's a lot of like short-term sales stuff happening. Our founder is doing just tons of conversation, tons of networking, being, like our VC firms connect us with other companies that might be a fit. So like there's a lot of that on the side stuff happening, and we're using marketing and content more as the like, okay, we want to build $1 billion company. What does that look like? What's the path to that? And like, where does content need to be to keep us on that curve? Versus saying like, I've been at other startups where it's like, okay, we need 100 customers in the door this month, and like marketing has to do that job. Let's get webinar signups. And we've purposely avoided that approach. Now that our sales team is growing, we're probably going to have to get more into that like lead capture mode. But yeah, we've kind of put the blinders on and been like, nope, long term. And then this is probably the year where we start to add more of the short term stuff as well.
Yeah, that's great. Cause like what I heard is that it starts with whatever the expectations are, right? And so like being aligned on, we're trying to build like this $1 billion company is very different than like we want to get acquired in like 3 years, right? And so the approaches are going to be different too, of like, if you were building a media style brand, right, and you were building it to be acquired, right, and you wanted to like build an audience quickly, and it was more like about signups, like you would have like a different approach because it's a different goal. And so I think it's like a good note for content marketers. And I guess this is top of mind for me, like just like doing a few interview processes and like accepting a job, of getting really clear, like with whoever you're talking to, the hiring manager, of like, what is going to be expected of me, right? Like what do you think that the goal of content is here? And like, am I comfortable with that too? So another thing that you mentioned is like the sales team. So like, because you're trying to build, this $1 billion company, and because you want, it sounds like he like wants you to be focused on those long-term bets, right? And like the really like big impactful things, like who's going to take care of like the short term, because that doesn't go away and you have to survive to get to that point, right? And so like sales is kind of like the answer there too. And like, some of the networking work that both like probably you like and the founder are doing too, of like what's going to be able to buy us the runway, to get to that point too.
Yeah. And we're supplementing it with some paid ads and things like that. But yeah, absolutely. And I give that advice. I've been talking to a few people recently trying to interview for similar roles to mine, where it's like first marketing hire, and you have to reverse interview the company a lot. You have to know what's your 5-year vision for the company? How do you envision this working with sales? All those sort of business things that you brought up. You can't get into the company and then try to uncover those things. You have to know what you're getting yourself into, because sometimes then you don't have that like marketer company fit. And it's more about finding the company that's the fit for like the kind of content you know how to make or want to make, or whatever. But you can't, like, the business model and founder's vision largely dictates the marketing strategy you should have for the most part, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I know, like, with my process too, like, part of it is, yeah, either like having a sales team in place that's going to, yeah, pick up like some of those like short-term wins, or like have a very clear idea of like the split between, because obviously you're doing like some product marketing too, which you could consider like bottom funnel content, like, if you will, like you're talking about like, basically conversion, like on the site, like getting those product pages. That was like the chicken or egg situation of I was thinking of. Was like, you at a certain point in the journey, like they're going to want to look at the product, right, and like dig into it and like see what it does and stuff. And like ideally, yeah, you have like specific feature pages, right, and product pages and stuff, but like you also just need people coming to the site in general, right, and like just being on their radar. And so it's like, yeah, it's figuring out like when you go in and do those things, which kind of like leads me to the next question of, okay, now we have like these two examples of, you have the SEO content, then you added podcasts, and I know there are other things after that, but for the sake of simplicity, like starting with those two things, at what point like did you know that the channel was scaled enough? Like, because I think content marketers, yeah, will either get trapped in like the, I'm scared to do the next thing, right? Like, or I feel too overwhelmed to do the next thing, and need like that extra sort of like push to just be like, it's just gonna be uncomfortable for a second, like while we stand this thing up. But the timing is important. So how do you get the timing right?
Yeah, it's a super good question. And I think so many marketers talk about strategy, and very few actually talk about like the day-to-day of like execution. Because I think like most of marketing is just like executing the plan, not the plan. And like using your time, using your like work week properly is the actual tough part of being a marketer. And both when I joined Doc, Alex and I had both worked in some capacity at companies where you ended up on like a content hamster wheel of like, okay, this week there has to be 4 social posts and 2 blogs and you get and the podcast and XYZ and so many things. And if you try to tackle them all at once, you kind of do a half-ass job at all of them. What's the Ron Swanson quote? He's like, never half-ass 2 things, always whole-ass 1 thing. It's exactly that. So when we started at Doc, we're like, okay, I'm a 1-person team. How do we go from nothing to lots of channels? The answer isn't to start lots of channels at once. It's to spin up 1 channel, be hyper-focused on it, figure out what does good look like, and then step 2, figure out like what does good look like quicker. So I'll use the blog for the example. Like when I started, and the other thing is we actually, counterintuitively to what I just said, we said because we want to not be on like a hamster wheel of just adding more, we set like an output target as like as a like minimum threshold, but also a maximum threshold. So we're like, okay, we're going to do 8 blogs a month, but that gives me a target to say, okay, like at first it's going to be hard to get to 8 blogs a month, but then it's going to be the opposite. And it's going to be really tempting to make 16 blogs a month or whatever. But we think 8 is the right number. And once we get to 8, then we want to do other things. And so having that number was very good at the beginning, because I think in my first month, it was like, okay, well, I have to get freelancers. So you need a lot of freelancers, or like 1 very non-busy freelancer to get to that many blogs a month. So it took like 2-3 months to find good freelancers. And then, okay, what does the blog briefing process look like? What is my like Airtable setup, et cetera, et cetera. And that whole thing took 3 months to get to a level where I was only working on the blog, and to get to a level where I was happy with the quality, happy with the outputs, like what is graphic design going to look like? All those questions, it took months to spin up. And then as of month 3-ish, then I was like, okay, I spent all my time on this. How do I achieve the same output in 3/4 of the time? And then 3 months later, how do I do the same in half the time? And now I'd say I can do 8 blogs a month with like a week and a bit of work a month. And then I have 3 weeks to do other things. And so to get back to your question of like, when is enough, I think you kind of have to have this initial target of what good looks like. Like, what do we want the program to look like as a whole? And then how do we get to like point A to point B and then point B to point C? You just have to do 1 channel at a time. Like, okay, this is the right quality. I'm going to squeeze down the time now to make it. And now I have the capacity to add a second thing. And now that thing's when we launched our podcast, that took over my life. And I was like, wow, this is totally untenable. I'm never going to be able to keep a weekly podcast going. And now it's like, not an afterthought, but it's like I have a 1 hour time slot on my calendar to work on the podcast a week. It's like, other than recording episodes. So I'm getting a little carried away because I'm excited with this topic, but
No,
I think
good.
that's kind of how I approached it.
No, I think like a lot of it seems is focus too, right? So like having like the focus, like that first quarter, and I don't know if this is exactly what the goals look like, but it's nice to be able to do things in quarters of just like, here's like the quarterly business goal, here's the quarterly like content goal. And at first it's a matter of just like, let's figure out like the end-to-end process, like everything from like the graphics to like you mentioned, like the Airtable to like onboarding the freelancers, right? Like just like get it set up and get to that volume that you want. And I think also having the like, what I think about is like the red, yellow, green kind of like stages, like similar to what companies usually do for like revenue goals too, like this would be good, but this would be great, right? And so trying to at least like, hit that good goal, like maybe in like that first quarter, and then that second one looks like, okay, how do I do this thing faster, as you said, right? Like same goal as before, but like how do I do this in like half the time, right? And so then it's a matter of like, how do I get from like this yellow space to like this green space in terms of the output, and also maybe be like thinking about what's next, right? Like being like one step ahead in terms of like, once we get there, like what's the next bet that we're going to take and why, for that kind of like next quarter, and then getting to that point where it's scaled, and then like kind of being able to take half of your resources or half of your energy and like put it somewhere else.
Yeah, and what I like too about this next step thing is we did sort of roughly follow the quarterly plan of like, okay, first quarter is blog, next quarter is podcast, etc. But while that whole first quarter is going, you give yourself time to think about the next channel and like, what does good look like? And if you were trying to condense that into a shorter time period, like you wouldn't have that sort of internal brainstorming time, or you start to be hyper-focused on what does a good podcast look like? And then you start to pay attention for months to other podcasts. And so by the time you're ready to actually do the thing, you've actually spent a lot of time thinking about it, versus if you're trying to launch all these things at once and you're just trying to like cram in, okay, this week I have to do a podcast. It gives you sort of more like noodling time that I like to have on these things. And now we're sort of in this space too, where we have like 4 really interesting projects sort of in limbo of what can we do next. And because we're so focused on one channel at a time, it also gives us time to then like, okay, which of these next ideas is the right one will depend on sort of how these next 3 months go. Because you can't be too forward looking at a startup. Like I said before, it's kind of a leaky bucket thing. And where's the real sort of content fire? And so instead of trying to do everything from day one, we were able to like bide time and see like, okay, now is the right time to do this project.
Yeah, you're kind of like penciling in like a short to-do list, like versus like Sharpie marker, like here's what's happening for like, it's all strategies, like marketing strategies are just like theories at the end of the day, right? And so it's important to have a theory of just like, if this works out well, what would we do next, right? Like, because you can also you can make the mistake of like not knowing what's next. Like once you hit that goal faster than you thought, right? It's just like, well, yeah, we're in the green now. Like that was actually faster than I thought. Like, I don't know what to do next. And like, now you have to spend energy figuring that out. And you get less, as you said, like noodle time, which I like is just like a line item unto itself of just like making sure you have enough noodling time, like just like passive, like simmer in the background of like, is this the right thing? Right. And being able to kind of ask those questions in the meantime without the pressure of like, you have to do this now, like make the decision now, right? So I like that in terms of like thinking about balancing programs and scaling it. So I think you mentioned 4. So that's like 2 that we kind of like went over. And I think you said now there's maybe like 4 like sort of main like programs as you see it. So maybe like go over what happened after those first 2.
I mean, really those are the really 2 big ones. And now we're starting to think about emails. Like we've done a good job at like making content, and we haven't done we haven't put a lot of focus on like email capture other than stuff happening in the product, like marketing kind of email capture, like newsletter and whatever, gating things, that kind of territory. And so we've been noodling for a while on what a good newsletter looks like. And that's something that we're planning to launch in early next year. Like we have a company newsletter that has product launches, and we'd occasionally mention the podcast, but we don't have like a proper worth subscribing to on its own content newsletter. And there's all the fun questions that come with that. Like, how do you brand it? Like, should it be branded the same as the podcast? Should it be branded like our company? Should it have its own thing?
Yep.
How? And then at the same time, we're thinking about our resources on our website. Like, do you brand the blog to the same as the newsletter? Do you brand it as its own thing? All this stuff, right? And so,
who should it come from? Right.
Yeah, in some ways, these are like silly questions when you're a seed stage startup and like not that many people are paying attention to you. But we're trying to think of like forward looking a year from now, 2 years from now, like what if we have 6 podcasts? Then it would be annoying if our newsletter was named after the podcast, and we have it. So that's a big one right now. Is thinking about what that looks like, and then also working on like our blog right now is also just like a feed of. It's like a linear feed of most recently published articles, and it's not the world's best UX. And part of the reason we're doing it is to like branding, and I want someone to be able to just look at the blog and read nothing and be like, these people understand me. Like they're talking about the things that I'm worried about. And if you just see like the most recent 6 SEO articles that we published this week, it's like not going to give you that feeling. And so I'm starting to think more about like website experience as well. And then I mentioned the idea of this something like a sales enablement library. We haven't figured out what we'll call it yet, but like really stellar examples of the type of content that like doc users would put in a doc workspace for their prospects. And so the ICP would be interested in examples of really great content. And I find, as like it's really hard to find that stuff. And so as like, I'm like, what can I do as a content marketer to help salespeople? Like, I know I can aggregate really good examples of content. And so salespeople and customer success people, I should say. So those are some, but what I want to do and what we want to do is not just have these like long-term safe, like slow growth bets, is like try to have some resources that are like more attention grabbing, or like viral is not the right term because none of these things are ever going to go viral, but like have something that's a little more of like a risk, or like it kind of just feels cool. And I think that makes it good content. And so that's kind of like the realm that I'm getting into now, that we've talked about these like optimized channels already that are like, now I've given myself time to think about these like fun projects.
So I think about like all of the foundational content they've created with like SEO content, and you have like the blog, and then you're thinking about adding like templates, and then there's kind of like these inspiration pieces, right? Like that have the potential to be viral, right? In terms of like, oh, this is a cool collection of, I don't know, email templates like that I would use as a salesperson, right? But this also kind of goes back to, I think it was DataBox, John Bonini, right? Like, and how he thinks about like different stages of content, specifically for kind of like SEO. And so you have kind of like your educational type pieces, but then earlier on in the funnel, you have kind of inspiration. But it makes sense for you to attack like the bottom funnel stuff first, right? And like get some traction going, like get kind of like those earlier wins, even though it's all long-term stuff. And so now you're coming back and you're like rounding out the content program, right? Like you're rounding it out so that you now have like those inspiration pieces that people can find too, where you're kind of like a true like media company, and that you have kind of like these actionable content, you have this inspiration type content. So I don't know if that's how you see it, or that's kind of like how you've thought it through, but even stuff like the UX, like of the blog, right? Like that's something that's like probably doesn't make as much sense, like as a seed stage company, to spend like, the entire quarter on like making like the best possible like user experience. But like once you have some people coming, once you know people like the type of content, it's like, how could I optimize this experience? So now it feels like for that first program, you're in kind of like that optimization stage.
Yeah, no, I think you said it much smarter than I ever would have. But like, here's a really good example. Before we were like, let's publish a blog, let's just post it. Like, who cares what the header graphic is, because nobody's going to see it, because, we get single digit traffic, like, a year ago or whatever, it's not going to be indexed on Google for a week. Let's just, if we publish it now, it's better than it's sitting there waiting to be perfect. But then at some point, you're like, okay, well, we're trying to now there's people looking at us. We want to make a really positive brand impression. We want to give people a feeling about what Doc is as a company. Now we're like over-indexing on that stuff. And like, we want our podcast branding to be like super cool and silly and like 90s. And we want, like, we have like a sort of Reading Rainbow style theme song for the podcast. So like I went and got like a local radio guy to record, and like we spent way too long on like brand for that stuff. Not because we thought it would drive better results, because we thought like this is the feeling we want to give people as a company. And so now it's going back to all that like SEO type content, that, you know, the content itself is good if you read it and you like bring up one of our competitor blogs. Like for the most part, it's like night and day reading them. But like the design and stuff like that was an afterthought. And now you're pulling up that like the feeling that Doc content gives you is going to be like more like elevated or whatever. But it was strategic to not worry about it before. And now we want to sort of over-index on it. It also goes to one of those like unfair advantage things that you talk about at a startup. Like we have our I forget his title, but like our head product designer is like a Webflow genius and like a design genius. And like I can give him a crappy little gray box outline of a page, and then he'll come back having made like the coolest thing in Webflow. And I was like, okay, well, that's way better. And that's like that's an unfair advantage that we should lean into. So now I'm like, okay, why are we not designing the heck out of every page on our site? Like, let's take December and make everything look really sweet. And that will, maybe make people 5% more likely to click book a demo.
Yeah, I think about like the pushback on SEO content and just kind of like some of the like more foundational, but sometimes like less fun content projects. But like the reason that you're able to like now spend time on like these like fancy intros and like sprucing up the UX, like is because like you have like that relief, like that you have this one like always on content program that's like generating results, right? Where it's like, again, like it kind of feels like you've duplicated yourself, where it's like, I have this thing, like we've kind of like plugged a few different like holes, then if I put in like the work and like now I'm gonna research kind of like what feels like frivolous things, like because I can. Yeah.
To that point too, like the product template pages we made at the beginning were like, let's just throw up a bunch of pages on the website for templates. And like some of the templates are okay, but some of them were just kind of like crappy. But then we're like, if this gets traffic, we'll pay attention to it. And then if the page ever does well, then like, okay, I can swoop in and fix up the template. But why would I spend hours and hours and weeks making like everything perfect to the end if no one's ever going to see it? Because it's still just a bet. So like trying to be a little bit like, it's not like sneaky, but it's like, okay, if someone notices, then we'll fix it. And like it's a really efficient way of working as a small team.
Yeah, I think that's a really good takeaway for people that are considering like a similar type of role, right? Of like, one, is this something that is the way of working that you like that you can relate with, right? Because it's not for everyone. Like you mentioned, you're like consulting with some people on, is this right for you? Or do you want to just like plug in, be more of a specialist like in a specific area, right? But if you go into a company, it's like, what do they need? Like what holes like do you have to fill? And then what are the next few things that you would do? And like, how do you bridge those gaps, right? Like, how do you get enough like coming in that you like can then like spend more time on something? Because it really is like hard to justify spending any amount of time on anything like as a startup marketer and stuff. But it makes the difference between like, good content and bad content. So I think I've heard you say like the 80% rule of like forcing yourself to like get in a space of like, if it's 80%, it's good enough. So maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of like your standards, like if that's changed, if that's the same in terms of like, if it's 80% good enough, like we're shipping it.
Yeah, I think that still holds true. But like you said, like as a channel matures, you can change your approach a little bit. But I think I was a like typical content marketer who was worried about the Oxford commas and the paragraph spacing and all of these little like minutia things that I think matter to an extent, but I was like over focused on those kinds of things versus like speed of delivery and driving business results. And so once you work at a startup where like there's no traffic to the website, you have to shift your focus to like, how do I get traffic to the website? Who cares if there's a comma? I need to publish this today, or else it's not going to drive results tomorrow. So it was about like finding a balance between like how much detail needs to be in a content brief for a freelancer, like what is the appropriate amount of hours to sink into this task, like should I over index on editing the first draft, like is that going to buy me more time? Like it's learning all these efficiencies, which is a really different process than like just start to finish trying to make like a beautiful piece of content. It's like how do I make a minimum level of content at a big enough scale in an efficient enough way that it drives business results quickly. And like that, it took me a really long time to wrap my head around that as a marketer who, you start as an individual contributor who someone's like, write something really nice, or like you're a freelancer and someone just hands you a project and like, okay, I can spend 20 hours on this, or I can spend 4 hours on this. And like, as long as my customer is happy and like it reads well, then I've done my job. But then once you're the person behind like pulling all the levers, then it's like, okay, well, I could spend infinite time making this perfect, but I'd have to get it out the door. And so that was like a big mindset shift I had to go through. But also like, you have to keep a minimum bar of quality in like a high minimum bar of quality, or else the content isn't going to do its job, right? If you're cranking out crappy SEO articles with like copy pasted AI content, it's not going to inspire your reader. So it's like constantly finding the balance of these two things. And you eventually just get a gut feel of, you know what, I've edited this article enough. Okay, yeah, sure, I could change that word and I could change that word, but I think it will do its job now. And like, publish, done. Use the same graphic as I used for the last article, whatever. Like, it's out the gate. We'll fix it later.
Yeah, it's a good rule of thumb of like, does this do the job, right? Because ultimately, like every piece of content has a job. So it's like, is this going to get it done? And partly like you're not going to know, right? And so you mentioned like even pushing some things out, at a quality that you're comfortable with, like maybe an 80% quality. And then like you can just like kind of like let the algorithm like sort some of those decisions out for you of just like, yeah, these ones are close, these ones are not. Then you focus on like the ones that are close, right? Or like the ones that are maybe like ranking in terms of like maybe a better user experience or a better like reading experience, like for those ones so that they can work even better once they have some traction. So the other part of this question, I think, is like, yeah, it's tricky to like let go of the craft, because I think for writers and content marketers in general, like you initially like made money because of like your craft, basically, right? Of like writing really nice things, as you mentioned, right? And then you have to kind of like switch on this other part of your brain of like, okay, like for me, it's been thinking about, okay, why does the way that I create this work, right? Like reverse engineering, like what works, right? And like, how can I turn those into like standards and like advice, like to better be able to work with and like onboard other people to, again, like kind of like scale yourself, but also just like scale the program. So question is, how did you think about onboarding and outsourcing, whether it was to tools or to people? Like what types of things do you think content marketers, especially content teams of one, like should think about outsourcing first?
Yeah. And so I think I always think about it in like, where am I uniquely adding value as like my personal skill set? Like what's the best thing for me to spend my time on as just things I'm good at? But also, where do I add unique value as like a member of Doc and like knowing the product really well, knowing the ICP really well, things that are very difficult to like impart that knowledge onto somebody else. So there's some things that are just tactical skills, like making a nice graphic. Like that's easy to outsource because it's just a hard skill that you have or you don't have. And as long as I prompt it well enough, like you're going to a real human, the output is going to be good. But like, how do I, giving a blog topic and expecting a freelance writer to know how to like entangle and weave the Doc story and the Doc product into like a top of funnel kind of like keyword or topic, that's really hard to outsource the whole thing. And so going back to your question of like, when do I know to outsource to a tool or a person or whatever, my process is kind of, okay, it's kind of this. I have, because we're spinning up one channel at a time, I've now developed a process for it. It's like, figure out if you want to do the thing. Like, is it worth writing blogs? Yes. Okay, check. Now do it from start to finish on your own. Like where, and then feel like what was really time consuming, like task wise, manual work wise. Once you've decided that it's worth, like once you've written 10 blogs and you're like, okay, this is the process, this is the right process. Now, like, where can I add efficiency with tools or automation or whatever? Like, okay, I'm always emailing all these freelancers the brief, and then I'm replying to their email, and okay, how can I automate all these emails? And that'll save me like 4 hours a week over the course of a year. That's whatever, I don't know, 200 hours. Great, I'll automate that. But then some things you can automate to tools. I tried tools first, but then some things like writing or design or whatever, then I'll outsource that to somebody else. And I think the tricky part is like some things feel like they might be easy to outsource to another person, and then you realize how much like knowledge goes into that. Like our podcast is a really good example of like we have a great freelancer we work with for the podcast for like making social media clips and things like that. But there's some things it's just like gut feel of like what is the highlight of the show that like most speaks to like the point we're trying to get across from the show, and like how it relates to our company and how we want our founder to come off. And like sometimes you have to insert yourself into that process and say, actually this is the best clip, or this is it. And some of that like gut feel connection to the company stuff is hard to outsource. So this is a really roundabout way of answering your question, but you kind of by trial and error, you figure out like where you are an essential link. And then if anything ever feels like you're just there doing the work manually, then try to cut yourself out of that process. So like a really good example for me is I was editing blogs and then I was pasting them into Webflow and formatting all the headings. And I was like, oh God, I'm spending 2 hours on this. This is something that I can outsource to somebody. Not because like, sometimes because they can do it better, sometimes because it's cheaper, but also just because you have to protect your time and this like value. If you want to really scale up a program with only one in-house employee, you have to just keep adding outside help. The only way to scale is through automation or outside help. So yeah, it's like any task that I'm like, I don't need to be the one doing this. I like pencil it to be outsourced and then sort of optimize over time, like what the best way of outsourcing it is.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice process, like a nice like flow chart of like, yes, no, like, do I need to be the one like doing this, right? And like you said, like sometimes you find that out the hard way of you notice yourself like doing tasks that don't need to be you, right? Or like that you don't even think about being as part of your, like weekly schedule, but you notice that it's taking up time. And then that's just like a trigger for you to kind of like outsource that in some way. So are there any like desert island, like content marketing or just marketing tools? Desert island, meaning like, this doesn't really make sense because if you're on a desert island, you probably wouldn't be doing your job. You probably wouldn't be as concerned about like the
working
docs revenue. You probably have like some other concerns at that point. But yeah, in theory, like, what are like the, 5 like most like critical tools for you?
Yeah, for me, it's Airtable is my command center, and like I'm a huge Airtable head. I don't know why they're not paying me yet. I need to get like an Airtable sponsorship, but I'd like cover my doc sweater and get Airtable. Because the reason I like Airtable, and there's comparable tools out there, and I'm not, if you want to use ClickUp or whatever, but like having that one centralized like command center where it's an inventory for everything, and it can also like an inventory of record of like, here's all my blog posts, here's all my keywords, here's how they all link together. But then also being able to automate from like one central. If you have your marketing data nicely organized, it opens up a lot of automation possibilities. And if everything's too scattered across tools, it's much harder to link things together and automate them. So for me, it's like a combination of Airtable and Zapier, and like Google Docs can do like 90% of the work I need done. And then they're adding point solutions over time. So, we use Descript for, I use that to make some videos. We record our podcast with Riverside. I'm looking at my nav bar here on the bottom of my screen. But I think it's like the takeaway I would want people to have is like, you need that like core centralized tool that is like your bread and butter that helps you multiply yourself. For me, that's Airtable. Some people, it's Notion, whatever. I actually don't think it matters which one you choose, as long as you just get really good at one of them, and then really good at connecting it to other tools.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the other part of this too is people, right? So I guess like the best question to ask is just like, how do you find good freelancers, or what are kind of like your, checks and balances for this? Is like a massive question. So just kind of like,
Yeah.
I think it's more, some of the gut things of like, what are some signs, of a good freelancer?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it depends on what type of freelancer. Like I mentioned before, there's some sort of just like hard skill tasks of like, okay, I need a graphic designer. I'm looking at their portfolio. It looks fine. And I ask them how much it costs, and I pick the one that's like the balance of cost and skill. Right? But for some things like blog writing it's an insanely variable market out there. Like the not to bash on like people who do well on LinkedIn, because like good for you, but like people who are popular freelancers or like well known, easily discoverable are also like of course going to be the most expensive. And when you have a limited budget and you have you have a certain quantity you want to achieve, you can't just go after like super expensive freelancers. So you also have to find like diamond in the rough people. And so like the best like always is like referrals or people I've worked with in the past, like at other companies who are now freelancers, or like in-house people who freelance on the side because like they haven't optimized their freelance business to the point where they can like charge the most they'll ever charge. Right. And because they're not like professional freelancers yet. And so like I'm in that boat as well of like I freelance sometimes on the side. I'm sure there's people who charge double or triple for like the same quality, but like, I got a client. Yay, that's good enough. Like one project a week, I'm happy with. And so, yeah, like referrals is a big one, like building a good network and just asking around, like who do you use for this? Or the other day I saw just like a really nice, it was like a podcast, like highlight reel from another B2B company. And I just said like, who made this for you? And they're like, oh yeah, here's the freelancer, like go nuts. And so like just asking around is great. I really don't recommend posting, I have a freelance role opportunity available. Who's interested? Because then you'll get 500 DMs every day for 3 months. If anytime I see someone do it, I like cringe out of my pants knowing what their DM situation looks like right now. And so, like for example, for that use case, I made an Airtable form that's like, if you're interested, here's the form. Please don't DM me. Fill this out. And so anyway, but then just going. So like the next thought of that is like, there's normally like a warming up process with any freelancer that we do for our blog. For example, we do a paid test where we do go through the whole like normal blog writing process. I treat them like, a little more hand holding than I would a writer who's been around, but not too much. Giving them all the background. Like I have this whole onboarding doc workspace I set up that like shows them like doc is the product, but also what do we expect from the blog. And nobody gets it right the first time. Like nobody perfectly knows how to like integrate doc into the article, but they're all going to be good writers. And then it's like, then I see how they take that feedback. How do they, like, what does the second one look like is normally the better test of a good freelancer. And then it's just like optimizing for like quality and cost over time.
Yeah, there's some good points there. I think like one of them was, when you see content in the wild, and I think this works, as you said, better for design of like, I like this design. Who did this? And you're like, reach out to whoever your person is in your network and be like, who did this like ad for you guys or whatever. And you get some suggestions that way. So that's like one way to use your network. But then also knowing for written content's a little bit different, because if you have like an editor or something, or you don't know how much is like the editor, how much is like them. And so taking that with like a grain of salt, but that can give you some sort of like inspiration. And then, so much of it is just like about that test stage of like fit, really, like you mentioned, marketer fit, marketer product kind of fit. There's something, same thing with like freelancers, right? Where it's like, they could be a good writer and a good freelancer, but maybe it's like not a perfect fit for this product because they're just like either not passionate about it, or it's not a priority, or like they're too expensive or whatever it is. And so I think like you mentioned, just having like a good onboarding system of like, okay, am I setting them up for success? Like, do they have the context that they need, like, to be the best that they can be at this? And am I seeing like their best possible work? And then realizing that it's not going to be until like that second or third draft that it's closer to like what you're going to be getting, because that first one is just kind of like is a guess. And I know this from like freelancing too, of like I've definitely turned in like first drafts and they're like, but there was like a second one, they're like, wow, like this is a lot better. And I'm like, yeah, because I like have no idea about this space. So anyways, yeah, completely relate. All right, well, the last question for you is basically just, what advice would you give to content marketers that are looking to like scale up their programs that like they have some traction on now and moving to the next one?
Yeah, I think a good like exercise that I went through was doing like a time audit of myself before I started adding a new thing and scaling things up. Is like, what do I want to add? How much time is that going to take? How much time is everything taking me now? Like literally every part of my blog process, every part of my podcast process, where can I cut time? Or like, where am I intend to be spending less time than I actually take. And I went through an exercise 6 months into my job and was like, I've planned 2 weeks worth of work in every week. And this is not possible to achieve what we want to achieve. And it's unrealistic. And that's why I always feel behind. And so like being like realistic and methodical about what you can actually achieve and doing it incrementally rather than going back to what we said at the start, rather than trying to tackle everything at once. And then, yeah, and being really realistic and honest with yourself and your leadership on what you can deliver.
Yeah, I love that. Like whether or not you're in-house or freelancer or what, you don't have to be like charging hourly to be like, what is my hourly rate right now? And like, how do I reduce that, right? Like, how do I get more out of my time? So last thing is just, where can people find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, Eric Doty. Find me, easy. Eight letters, so it's easy. Low effort, high efficiency to search me.
Yeah, I'll even say DOTY, right? And Doty, which I didn't get right the first time, but now I got it down pat. All right, well, Eric, it's been great chatting and meeting in as close as to in person as we get these days. And I'm excited to keep chatting and see kind of what that next content program that you guys roll out at Doc looks like.
For sure, and I'm excited to know what you're up to. You're holding your cards close to your vest, but I'm sure we'll find out soon.
I know. Like I don't think that I'm gonna like last until like January 1st. I got like I'm not good with secrets, so we'll see if I like spill the beans before then.
Okay,
all right.
perfect.
See you, Eric.
Thanks for listening to Content Logistics. This episode was produced by Motion, a done-for-you B2B podcasting agency for busy marketers. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.